"Step back, officer, that dog knows something you don't." The words came from the edge of Main Street in Mercy Ridge, Montana, where the morning wind moved cold through the church bells and carried the smell of wet stone, diesel, and pine smoke down from the hills. For 3 long seconds, nobody spoke. Not the shopkeepers standing beneath the striped awning of Miller's Hardware. Not the children frozen beside the school bus, with their backpacks still hanging from one shoulder. Not the young patrolman whose hand hovered near the leash of the large German shepherd at his side. And certainly not the old man standing on the church steps, trembling beneath a brown wool coat that looked too thin for the season, both arms wrapped around a small wooden box as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. The dog's name was Soldier, and every person in town knew him by sight. 6 years old, broad-chested, black and tan, with a silvering muzzle and amber eyes sharp enough to make grown men straighten their posture. Soldier had the calm discipline of an animal trained to listen before he moved. That was why the crowd gasped when the command came, and why the silence grew heavier when Soldier surged. Forward 3 steps, stopped inches from the old man, lowered his head, and refused to go any farther. The old man squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for something that never came. Instead, Soldier turned sideways, planting his body between the trembling man and the street, his ears high, his tail low, a quiet rumble rising from his chest that sounded less like anger than warning. Across the road, Daniel Cross set down the wrench he had been using beneath the hood of a rusted blue pickup. He was 40 years old, tall, white, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered face of a man who had learned to sleep lightly and trust slowly. His dark hair carried thin lines of gray near the temples, and a week of stubble shadowed his jaw. Daniel had come home from the army with 2 things still intact: his habit of noticing what others missed, and his belief that a good dog never broke discipline without a reason. He knew Soldier better than anyone in Mercy Ridge knew. Years ago, before the town called him a police dog, Soldier had worked beside Daniel in search and rescue, listening through dust, rain, and collapsed silence for signs of life human ears could not catch. Now the dog stood in front of a frightened old man as if guarding a secret. Daniel crossed the street slowly, palms open, voice low. "Easy, Soldier." The dog glanced back once, and in that single look Daniel felt the old signal return. Not danger, not rage, recognition. The old man opened his eyes, pale blue and wet with fear, and whispered, "Daniel Cross." Daniel stopped. The church bell above them shifted in the wind, though no hand touched the rope. Soldier pressed his nose against the wooden box and gave one soft bark. Then the old man said, "Your father told me this day would come." Daniel felt the name of his father move through the crowd, like a match struck in a dark room. For years, Mercy Ridge had spoken of Thomas Cross only in half sentences, with lowered eyes and the kind of silence people used when they were not sure whether a man was a hero or a shame. Daniel looked at the old man on the church steps and kept his voice steady. "Who are you?" The old man swallowed, his thin fingers tightening around the wooden box. "Walter Bellamy," he said. "I rang the bell here for 43 years. I knew your father before this town forgot how to say his name kindly." The young officer shifted uneasily, his cheeks red from the cold and embarrassment. "Mr. Bellamy, you cannot just force your way into City Hall waving old stories." People were scared. Walter turned toward him, not angry, only tired. "People have been scared of the truth in this town since before you were born." Soldier gave a low whine and pressed closer to the box. Daniel crouched beside him, resting one hand on the dog's thick neck. Soldier's muscles were tight, but his eyes were clear. He was not confused. He was working. "What is in the box, Walter?" Daniel asked. Walter looked past him toward the white church tower rising above Main Street. Its paint had peeled in long strips, and the bell rope behind the open arch swayed gently, though the morning had gone still. "Not here," Walter whispered. "Too many ears." From the hardware store porch, an older woman called out, "Daniel, maybe let the sheriff handle this." Daniel did not look away from Walter. "Sheriff is 20 miles out answering a road call. Right now I am the only person here Soldier trusts." The officer frowned. "That dog belongs to the department." Daniel finally turned his gray-blue eyes toward him. "No, he works for the department. There is a difference." A small murmur passed through the crowd. Soldier took one careful step up the church stairs and tapped the wooden box with his paw. Once, then again. Walter's breath caught. "He knows," the old man said. Daniel stood. "Knows what?" Walter lowered his voice until Daniel had to lean closer. The sound beneath the bell, at that exact moment, the church bell above them gave a soft, lonely note. Not loud. Not enough to startle the town. Just one deep tremble that rolled through the old beams and faded into the street, like a memory trying to speak. Soldier lifted his head at once, ears forward, nose high. Daniel felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He had heard that focus before, in broken buildings after storms, when soldier found a living heartbeat beneath concrete and dust. Nobody rang that, the officer whispered. Walter's eyes filled, but his voice stayed firm. No, it rings when the ground moves under the tower. Daniel looked at the church foundation, at the old stone steps, at the narrow iron door half hidden behind winter vines near the side wall. There is a basement under there. Walter gave a faint nod. More than a basement. Daniel stepped closer. Why did you come looking for me? Walter opened the wooden box just enough for Daniel to see a faded photograph, a brass military engineer badge, a small iron key, and a folded map marked with his father's handwriting. Because Thomas Cross saved this town once, Walter said, and I helped bury the proof. Soldier gave 3 soft barks, each one measured and certain. The crowd fell silent again. Daniel reached for the iron key, and for the first time that morning, Walter let the box go. Daniel held the iron key in his palm, feeling its cold weight settle against the old scars across his knuckles. It was smaller than he expected, dark with age, its teeth worn smooth by hands that had turned it many years before him. Walter closed the wooden box with a soft click and glanced toward the side of the church where the narrow iron door waited beneath a curtain of brown vines. That key belonged to your father, he said. Daniel looked up sharply. My father never owned anything in this town except a bad reputation. Walter's mouth trembled. That is what we let you believe. The young officer took a cautious step closer. Mr. Cross, I should call this in. Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off the door. Then call it in. But nobody touches that basement until Soldier clears it. Soldier had already moved ahead, nose low, paws soundless on the frosted grass along the church wall. He paused at the iron door, sniffed the lower hinge, then looked back at Daniel, with the steady patience of an old partner, waiting for a command. Daniel followed, Walter moving slowly beside him with one hand braced against the stone. You should sit down, Daniel said quietly. Walter gave a thin laugh. Son, I have been sitting on this truth for nearly 4 decades. I would rather stand for the last few minutes of it. The words struck Daniel harder than he wanted to show. He slid the key into the lock. At first, nothing happened. The metal resisted with a dry, stubborn scrape. Soldier gave one soft huff, as if urging him not to stop. Daniel adjusted the angle, turned again, and the lock opened with a hollow sound that seemed too deep for such a small door. A breath of cold air drifted out, carrying the scent of limestone, dust, and something faintly sweet, like old cedar kept in darkness. The officer shined his flashlight inside. A narrow stairway dropped beneath the church, its stone walls damp, its wooden rail polished by time. That does not look safe, he said. Daniel gave him a calm glance. Most things worth finding never do. Walter touched the wall before stepping down. Your father said the same thing the night the water came. Daniel turned. What water? Walter did not answer right away. They descended slowly, Soldier first, Daniel behind him, then Walter and the officer. Above them, the town's whispers faded until only their breathing, and the soft scrape of boots filled the stairwell. At the bottom, Soldier stopped so suddenly Daniel nearly touched his back. The dog's ears rose. His nose pointed toward the far wall where rows of old wooden shelves leaned under stacks of church records, lanterns, rusted tools, and sealed metal boxes. What is it, boy? Daniel whispered. Soldier moved to a cracked section of stone behind a fallen pulpit board and pawed once at the floor. Walter's face went pale in the flashlight glow. That is where he hid it. Daniel knelt, brushing away dust from a rectangular outline in the floor. There was an old brass handle, set nearly flush with the stone. The officer breathed out. A trapdoor? Walter shook his head. A record vault. Built after the flood of 1986, your father designed it to protect deeds, maps, and emergency plans. But after that night, the mayor ordered it sealed. Daniel wrapped his fingers around the handle. Why? Walter looked at him with eyes full of regret. Because what was inside could have saved your father's name and ruined half the men running this town. Soldier gave 3 quiet barks into the dark, and somewhere behind the stone, something answered with a faint metallic ring. Daniel pulled the brass handle, and the stone panel lifted, with a slow, grinding sigh that rolled through the basement like the church itself had been holding its breath. Dust rose in a pale veil around his boots. Soldier stepped back, then lowered his nose toward the opening, listening so intensely that even the young officer stopped moving. Beneath the panel was not a deep pit, but a narrow steel compartment lined with oilcloth. Inside sat a black metal case no larger than a lunch pail, its corners scratched, its latch sealed with a strip of brittle red wax. Daniel stared at it, unable to speak. Walter leaned one hand against the shelf beside him. He made me swear not to open it, unless the town came for his son, he said. Daniel's voice came out low. The town did not come for me. I came because a dog refused a bad command. Walter looked down at Soldier, and something like wonder softened his face. Maybe that is how mercy works. It finds a way around proud men. The officer cleared his throat. That case could be evidence. We should wait for the sheriff. Daniel nodded slowly, but Soldier gave a sharp single bark, not loud, just firm enough to make everyone freeze. Then the dog pressed his nose to the wax seal and whined. Walter closed his eyes. "There is a letter on top," he whispered. "Thomas said you would know whether to read it aloud." Daniel broke the wax with his thumb. The latch opened easily, as if it had been waiting for his hand all these years. Inside lay a stack of yellowed papers tied with blue ribbon, a roll of survey maps, several photographs, and an envelope addressed in faded black ink, "To my son Daniel when silence has cost too much." Daniel's fingers trembled once, then steadied. He opened the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. "Danny," he read, his voice rough around the name. "If this letter has found you, then the truth took longer than I prayed it would. I did not leave Mercy Ridge because I was guilty. I left because the men who wanted the valley land had more power than I had, witnesses. The church tower sits above the spring line. If they built their private road through the East Ridge, the floodwater would have nowhere to go. Homes would be lost. Families would be scattered. I stopped the survey. They called me a thief, a liar, and worse, but I would rather lose my name than watch this town lose its people." The basement seemed to grow colder. The officer lowered his flashlight. "My grandfather lived on East Ridge," he said quietly. "He always said somebody saved those houses." Walter wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thomas did, and I kept the maps hidden because I was afraid." Daniel looked at him, pain and anger moving behind his eyes, but his voice stayed calm. "Afraid of who?" Walter pointed toward the papers. "The Bell Tower Trust. The land beside this church, the house, the spring rights. It was never supposed to go to the town council. It was left to your father, and after him to you." Soldier stepped closer and rested his head against Daniel's leg. Above them, the bell gave one soft note, and this time Daniel did not wonder who had rung it. Daniel carried the metal case upstairs himself, with Soldier close against his left knee, and Walter climbing slowly behind them, one hand on the rail, each step taking more courage than strength. By the time they reached the side door, half of Mercy Ridge had gathered in the churchyard, their faces pale in the mountain light, their whispers moving like dry leaves over the grass. The young officer stepped out first and raised one hand. "Everyone stay back," he said, but his voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a man trying to control a scene. It was the voice of a man who had just found out the ground under his town was not as solid as he believed. Daniel emerged with the old papers under his arm. Across the street, the mayor's black Tahoe rolled to the curb, tires crunching over gravel. Mayor Ellis Vard stepped out in a charcoal coat, silver hair combed perfectly, smile already prepared for the crowd. "Daniel," he called, warm as a church bulletin and twice as thin. "I hear there has been some confusion." Soldier stopped walking. His ears rose. Daniel noticed. "Not confusion," Daniel said. "Records." The mayor's smile tightened. "Old records can be misunderstood." Walter came forward, breathing hard but standing straight, only by men who need them misunderstood. A hush fell. Mayor Vard looked at him with the polite impatience. "People save for the elderly when they think memory has become harmless. Walter, you should be home resting." Walter shook his head. "I rested for 38 years. It did not help my soul." Daniel opened the metal case on the hood of the rusted blue pickup. The wind lifted the edges of the maps, and Soldier placed one paw gently on the corner as if helping hold the truth in place. Daniel spread out the survey of East Ridge, the spring line marked in his father's handwriting, the proposed private road drawn in red, the houses below it circled one by one. "My father stopped this project," Daniel said, "because it would have redirected floodwater into the valley." An older man near the hardware store removed his cap. "My mother lived below that ridge." A woman beside him whispered, "So did we." The mayor stepped closer. "These are technical matters. You would need an engineer to interpret them." Daniel looked at him, calm and tired. "I was an Army Corps engineer for 12 years. The mayor had no answer ready for that. The officer picked up a second document, scanned it, and looked toward Daniel. "This deed lists Thomas Cross as trustee of Bell Tower House in the Spring Acres." Walter nodded. "The land was given to him by Clara Whitcomb after he saved her family during the flood. She wanted it protected, not sold." Daniel felt the crowd shifting, not against him now, but towards something they had buried together without knowing its shape. Mayor Vard lowered his voice. "Daniel, whatever you think this proves, we can discuss it privately." Soldier gave one low bark. Daniel almost smiled. He does not like private discussions when public truth will do. Walter reached into the box and handed Daniel the faded photograph of Thomas Cross standing beside the church bell. Younger than Daniel remembered him, one hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy Daniel recognized as himself. On the back, in firm ink, were the words, "The bell belongs to whoever protects the valley." Daniel looked up at the tower. The bell moved once in the wind, shining dull bronze against the Montana sky. For the first time since childhood, he did not feel like the son of a disgraced man. He felt like the son of someone who had stood alone and still chosen mercy. The crowd stayed in the churchyard long after the mayor stopped speaking, as if everyone in Mercy Ridge understood that silence had become a witness too. Mayor Vard glanced at the maps, then at the faces around him, and whatever polished answer he had carried from City Hall seemed to fade in the cold air. "Those documents need proper review," he said. Daniel folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Then review them in the open." The mayor's jaw tightened. "You are making a mistake." Soldier stepped forward, not threatening, simply present, his amber eyes fixed and steady. The young officer moved between them with a quiet firmness that surprised even himself. "Mayor, I think it would be best if we wait for the sheriff." A murmur of approval passed through the crowd. Walter gave a tired smile. "Look at that," he whispered to Daniel. The boy found his spine before noon. Daniel almost laughed, but the sound caught somewhere behind his ribs. He looked toward the church tower, where the bell rope swayed behind the open arch. "You said there was a house." Walter nodded toward the lane that curved behind the church and climbed a little rise toward the pines. "Bell Tower House, white porch, green shutters, roof like an old soldier's cap. Your father kept it standing with his own hands for a while. After he left, nobody touched it much. Folks said it was cursed by shame." Daniel looked at him. "Was it?" Walter shook his head. "No, son, only locked by guilt." They walked together, leaving the crowd behind in a slow procession of whispers and footsteps. Soldier led the way along the gravel lane, nose low, tail moving once whenever the wind shifted. The house appeared beyond a row of bare cottonwoods, smaller than Daniel expected, but solid. Its white paint had weathered to cream. The porch sagged slightly at one corner. A rusted wind chime hung by the front door, turning without sound. For a moment, Daniel could not move. He had no clear memory of the place, only flashes. His father's hand holding his, the smell of sawdust, a woman laughing from somewhere near the kitchen, sunlight falling across a wooden floor. Walter placed the old key in Daniel's palm. "He wanted you to come back when the town was ready to tell the truth." Daniel stared at the door, and if it never was. Walter's voice softened. "Then God sent the dog." Soldier looked back as if he had heard his name inside the prayer. Daniel opened the door. Warm dust and cedar drifted out, untouched by years but strangely gentle. Inside, sheets covered the furniture. A braided rug lay faded in the hall. On the wall hung a framed drawing of the church tower, sketched in pencil by a hand Daniel knew before his mind admitted it. "My mother drew that," he whispered. Walter nodded. She believed the bell sounded different for honest men. Soldier moved through the hall, paused beside the fireplace, and nosed at a loose brick near the hearth. Daniel crouched. "Again," he murmured. The dog gave one soft huff. Behind the brick was a small tin box wrapped in cloth. Daniel opened it and found a child's wooden soldier, a brass button, and a note in his father's handwriting. He read it silently first, then aloud. "Daniel, if you ever feel the world has taken your home, build one anyway. Start with kindness. It is the only foundation that survives a flood." Walter bowed his head. Daniel sat back on his heels, holding the note as the room blurred. Outside, the old wind chime finally rang, clear and bright, and Soldier lay down beside the hearth as if he had known all along where they were meant to rest. By late afternoon, Mercy Ridge had grown quieter, but not calmer. Word of the papers had moved through town faster than the wind, passing from the diner to the feed store, from the school office to the barber shop, until every porch seemed to hold someone staring toward Bell Tower House. Daniel remained inside with Walter and Soldier, sorting through the tin box and the metal case on the kitchen table, beneath a yellow lamp that flickered whenever the old refrigerator hummed. The room smelled of cedar dust, cold ashes, and the faint sweetness of apples left too long in a cellar. Walter sat wrapped in a quilt Daniel had found over the back of a chair, his thin hands around a cup of coffee. "You do not have to read all of it tonight," he said. Daniel turned another page, his eyes moving across his father's handwriting. "I spent 30 years hearing pieces from people who never knew the whole. I can handle the whole." Soldier lay near the kitchen door, but he was not sleeping. His ears shifted at every sound outside. The young officer, whose name Daniel had finally learned was Caleb Price, stood by the window with his hat in both hands. "There are people gathering by City Hall," Caleb said. "Some are angry, some are ashamed. Most do not know what to believe. Daniel looked up. That is usually when truth costs the most. Walter nodded slowly. Thomas used to say that. Caleb turned from the window. Mr. Cross, I owe you an apology. Daniel closed the folder. For what? Caleb's face tightened with honest discomfort. For giving an order before I understood the man in front of me. Walter was scared, and I treated him like a problem. Walter lifted one eyebrow. Well, son, you were loud, nervous, and wrong. That makes you young, not hopeless. Caleb gave a small, embarrassed smile. Daniel leaned back in the chair. Soldier knew you were not cruel. If he had thought that, he would not have simply stood between you. At the sound of his name, Soldier raised his head. Then he stood, not suddenly, but with purpose. His nose lifted toward the back of the house, toward a narrow pantry door beside the stove. Daniel noticed at once. What is it? Soldier walked to the pantry and pressed his nose to the lower panel. Walter frowned. That pantry was always strange. Your mother said it stayed colder than the rest of the house. Daniel opened the door. Inside were empty shelves, a broom, several jars clouded with age, and a square of floorboards darker than the rest. Soldier pawed once at the seam. Caleb crouched and ran his flashlight over it. There is a pull ring here. Daniel's pulse slowed, the way it always did when a moment became serious. He lifted the ring and a hidden panel opened to reveal a shallow crawl space beneath the kitchen. A small canvas bag rested inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with rope. Walter whispered, I did not know about that. Daniel pulled the bag free and set it on the table. Inside were bank documents, a bundle of letters from families on East Ridge, and one sealed envelope marked with Clara Whitcomb's name. Caleb read the top page and went still. Daniel, he said carefully, this is not just a deed. This trust has been earning money for decades. Daniel stared at him. How much? Caleb swallowed. Enough to restore the house, protect the spring acres, and maybe help every family your father tried to save. Walter covered his mouth with one trembling hand. Soldier stepped beside Daniel and leaned against him, steady as a promise. Outside, the church bell rang once, clear across the cooling valley, and this time the whole town heard it. The bell's single note drifted over Mercy Ridge and seemed to pull the whole town toward Bell Tower House. By dusk, people stood along the lane in quiet clusters, some with coats thrown over work shirts, some still holding grocery bags or coffee cups, all looking at the small white house, as if it had risen from the past, while they were not paying attention. Daniel stood on the porch with the trust papers in one hand and his father's letter in the other. Soldier sat beside him, calm but alert, his black and tan coat touched by the amber porch light. Walter remained just inside the doorway, wrapped in the quilt, looking smaller than before but strangely lighter, as if confession had taken years off his soul and strength out of his bones at the same time. Caleb Price came up the steps carrying a folder from his patrol car. Sheriff is on his way, he said. He told me to secure the documents and make sure nobody leaves with them. Daniel looked toward City Hall, where Mayor Vard stood at the edge of the crowd with 2 council members beside him. Nobody is leaving with anything, Daniel said. Not anymore. Walter cleared his throat, then read Clara's letter. Daniel turned. Now, Walter's eyes moved over the waiting faces, especially now. Daniel opened the envelope marked Clara Whitcomb and unfolded the pages carefully. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, and firm. His voice carried across the yard, low at first, then steadier. To the people of Mercy Ridge, if this letter is read, then Thomas Cross has either been doubted, forgotten, or wronged. I leave the Bell Tower House, the Spring Acres, and the trust attached to them to Thomas Cross and his lawful heirs, not as payment but as protection. He refused money when he saved my family from the flood. He refused praise when others mocked him. He asked only that this land never be used to harm the valley. The crowd was so still that Daniel could hear the wind move through the dry cottonwood branches. An elderly woman near the front pressed a hand to her mouth. My father said Thomas carried children out of the lower road that night, she whispered. We thought it was just a story. Walter stepped onto the porch. It was not a story. It was a debt we never paid. Mayor Vard pushed forward, his face pale but controlled. This is emotional, but legal matters are not settled by porch readings. Caleb opened his folder. No, Mayor. They are settled by signatures, county stamps, and recorded trust numbers. These documents have all 3. A murmur rose, stronger this time. Daniel looked at the mayor, not with triumph, but with the tired sadness of a man seeing how long pride could outlive truth. Why hide it, he asked. Vard's mouth tightened. I inherited old decisions. Walter answered before Daniel could. Then you should have had the courage to bury them properly, or bring them into the light. Soldier stood then, ears raised toward the church. The bell began to ring again, not wildly, not loudly, but in slow, measured notes that rolled over the valley. No one moved toward the rope. No one needed to. Walter gripped the porch rail, tears bright on his face. Thomas always said the bell would sound right when the truth came home. Daniel folded the letter and looked out at the people who had once avoided his name. The trust will restore the spring line first, he said. Then the lower road drainage. Then Bell Tower House will become a place for veterans passing through, old folks who need repairs, and anyone this town forgot how to see. A man in the crowd removed his hat. A woman nodded through tears. Caleb looked down at Soldier and said softly, "I guess he was the first one to know." Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head. "No," he said. "He was the first one brave enough to listen." Morning came soft over Mercy Ridge, laying pale gold across the church tower, the cottonwoods, and the porch of Bell Tower House. The crowd had gone home hours earlier, but something in the town had stayed awake. Lights burned in kitchens before sunrise. Doors opened quietly. People crossed the street not with rumors this time, but with coffee, tools, old photographs, and the careful expressions of those who knew apology was not a word to spend cheaply. Daniel stood in the front yard with Soldier at his side, watching Caleb Price help the sheriff carry the metal case into a county evidence box. Walter sat on the porch wrapped in the same quilt, a mug warming his hands. "You look like your father this morning," Walter said. Daniel glanced back at him. "Tired and stubborn?" Walter smiled. "Honest enough to be dangerous." The sheriff, a broad woman with silver hair tucked beneath her hat, walked up the path and handed Daniel a receipt for the documents. "The trust is real," she said. "County records confirm the stamps. It will take lawyers to clean up the mess, but Bell Tower House and the Spring Acres are yours by lawful succession." Daniel looked at the old house, then at the church beyond it. "They are not just mine." The sheriff studied him. "That so?" Daniel nodded. "My father protected this place so families could stay. I will do the same." Caleb stepped closer, face serious. "I put in a request to retire Soldier from department service." Daniel turned quickly. Soldier's ears lifted as if he understood every word. Caleb swallowed. "After yesterday, I do not think he belongs behind commands that do not trust his judgment. Department agrees. If you are willing, he can stay with you." Daniel looked down at the German shepherd who had crossed years, silence, and shame to bring him home. "What do you think, boy?" Soldier leaned his head against Daniel's leg, heavy and certain. Walter chuckled softly. "That sounds like a yes." By noon, Mercy Ridge began repairing what it could reach. Men from the hardware store fixed the sagging porch. 2 women from the diner washed the windows. A retired plumber checked the pipes and said, "This house has better bones than half the new ones." Daniel found Walter in the kitchen, running his fingers over the edge of the table. "You can stay here," Daniel said. Walter looked up, startled. "I have a room above the old Bell office." "You have stairs that creak and a stove older than both of us." Walter's eyes misted. "Daniel, I do not deserve kindness from you." Daniel placed his father's note on the table between them. "Maybe deserving is not the point. Maybe returning it is." That evening the church bell rang for the first official time in years. Not by mystery, not by wind, but by Walter's hand pulling the rope while Daniel stood below with Soldier beside him. The sound moved across the valley in slow bronze waves, over East Ridge, over the lower road, over every house his father had once protected without thanks. People came out onto porches and listened. Some bowed their heads. Some cried quietly. Daniel did neither. He simply stood in the fading Montana light, one hand resting on Soldier's warm back, feeling the shape of home return not as a place given to him, but as a duty he was finally ready to carry. Walter released the rope and whispered. Thomas heard that. Daniel looked toward the sky above the tower where the last light held on like a promise. "I hope so," he said. Soldier gave one soft bark, then lay down at Daniel's feet, calm at last. And from that day on, no one in Mercy Ridge remembered Soldier as the dog who disobeyed. They remembered him as the loyal heart that listened when people forgot how, and led a broken town back to the truth it had buried beneath its own silence. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.